Welcome to Final Fantasy Ranked. Ranked by you. Since 1987, since the NES, from single player to MMO to online, from exclusives to multi-platform consoles to PCs to phones, from Japan to the rest of the world, ranked by our Discord, we're going to be going through your top ranked Final Fantasy games, tabulating everyone's rankings together to create an ultimate compromise of what we consider our best Final Fantasies, our favorite Final Fantasies. The reasoning for how to rank them is yours, but the results are in. The time is now. Here we go. We have 17 ranked games. These are the ones that most people wrote in. Single-player Final Fantasy mainline games. Some people, actually only Leonot, sent in other games that were not on the list, but it had no matter. It didn't vote any higher, so I just did 17 of them. That's in order of release: Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 2, 12, 13, 13, 2, Lightning Returns, 15, and, of course, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Got some choices. At the bottom of the list, the Nomura tier. At number 17, we have this one. Final Fantasy II. The introduction of leveling by use spells to level them up higher, get hit to get stronger. It was the first sequel and already trying brave new things. It only had 3 people vote for it. 2 votes were quite low. 1 vote was fairly high. I think a lot of people just didn't play it. A big jump in the story, according to many people. Almost could have been a Saga game. Interesting. Felix liked to, played it on the PSP. Here are the people who voted for it: Solace, Claudio, Ciflon, Felix. Now I'm doubting myself. Maybe Felix ranked it and it should be higher. Well, that's what it is. Final Fantasy II. I did not play it. I think a lot of people might not have played it as well. Fascinating game to say the least. I think the interesting thing about it is that Square had a hit with Final Fantasy I, and they already went ahead and changed things up and showed that they're not afraid. They're not afraid to try new things, and this is something that they would do throughout the rest of the series. Second to last, down in the Nomura tier, just a few points more than Final Fantasy II. This was ranked by Claudio, Solace, and Ciflan again. Final Fantasy I, the original. Made in 1987. The famous story being that this was the last gasp for Square as a game company, and Sakaguchi convinced them, hey, let's just copy what they did with Dragon Quest. Square did it. They took that RPG money and they never looked back. No Cid in this original game, although they retconned him in later. No Chocobos, just Final Fantasy I. Welcome, Ruth. We are ranking the games, not the soundtracks. At number 15, we have this little treat. Final Fantasy III. Voted by Lachlan, Chris, Claudio, and Ciflan. The first one with the job system, 23 different jobs This is a quote from Chris, or Greywalk, as he in on a chat. He says, it really set the precedent for the quality of storytelling to come, while also nailing down the gameplay of the earlier games and refining them to the modern standards of their contemporaries. And again, they do something very interesting. The first one was pretty similar to Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy II introduced that crazy leveling system where you have to get hit to get stronger. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? And then introducing a job system, which actually feels a lot more like an actual RPG. Okay. All right. So, number 14. This was voted very highly by two people voted this quite highly. 2 others voted it sort of in the middle of the pack. A very divisive game. I think a game that didn't get played by a lot of people for reasons you'll see. Lightning Returns. Third in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. This is the track Luxurion Day, which took me a long time to find. One of the most beautiful tracks, I think. I thought this one would be ranked a little bit higher just because of our channel, because of our chat. We have a wide range of people voting on this. People that have only played certain eras, people that have only played the earlier games, people have only played the later games. Definitely have to rank the logos after. Lightning Returns was pretty interesting. I think of it as the Majora's Mask of Final Fantasy XIII. 13 had a lot of criticisms about it being narrow, about it not having an open world, no airship, no NPCs. Actually, there was an airship. But it went against a lot of the things people like in the original Final Fantasy games. This one had it all. Big open areas, big towns, lots of NPCs, Moogles, Chocobos, everything you could want. Lots of customization. I think it was a real sort of trying to explore every nook and cranny of RPGs and Final Fantasy. A good battle system too. I had a lot of fun playing this the first time. Not so much the second time, which I think dropped it down on the list. Because the first time I played this, I remember sitting on the last day, because you only have, say, 13 days before the world ends. And you're dealing with all these NPCs deciding who's going to get to go to heaven and fixing all their problems while they're on Earth. And I remember listening to this song and just looking out at the town, all these people going about their business, knowing that this would be the last day and they're all going to die. And how far we'd come in the battle system and in the story, and how far we'd come in the trilogy. But playing it again the second time, I found all that stuff a bit more tedious, and it didn't hold up for me. It's one of the ones I ranked a little bit lower. This was ranked really high by a couple of people and quite lower by some others. Number 13. This one was voted very high by one, kind of in the middle, packed by 2 others, and a lot lower by somebody else. But it had more votes than a few of the other games. So it was starting to hit that sweet spot of more people playing it. And you're going to hear it right now. Final Fantasy V, only in Japan for a number of years. It's released in 1992. The job system came back. Now it has 22 jobs instead of the 21 jobs of Final Fantasy III. Introduced the Blue Mage and the recurring mini-boss Gilgamesh. A while back, I wanted to play every Final Fantasy game. I didn't have enough time to play them all in completion, but I just started jumping into different Final Fantasies and trying at the beginnings. And I was struck by the big, colorful world, the opening to this game. It had kind of a nice, soft, welcoming, almost like Pokemon feel to me. I think it's one that a lot of people didn't play. and you would have to make a bit of an effort to go back to it. But a lot of people liked it, although it only got 4 votes. So in this sense, not a lot of people liked it, but more than Lightning Returns than the rest. It's about the closest to Dragon Quest you're going to get in this series. Tons of people have not played it. It has your favorite battle system, Claudio. So what's different? Is it because of the job system that makes it better? Okay, this one had how many votes? It had 2 quite high votes, a middle vote, and a slightly lower one. So again, this one only had 4 votes. The same as Final Fantasy V, but it beat it out by 4 points. So it got a little bit higher of a ranking. So let's listen, shall we?
Almost there, Cloud. We're almost there.
Final Fantasy VII Remake, for those that don't know. A pretty interesting game. How do you remake the best-selling and most loved, objectively, subjectively speaking, game in your franchise? A game that defined an era that brought RPGs to so many people. A game that had been teased to be remade for so long, and they finally did it. Again, another brave new direction for Square. They used the game's history and nostalgia as an actual story mechanic. They blend the strategic menu combat into real-time. I was a big fan of the real-time combat system here. I liked it a lot more than Final Fantasy 15. This is part 1 of the game, of course. We have no idea where it's going to go, and it had a jaw-dropping ending that I don't think anybody could have possibly predicted. It definitely feels like they took the old Final Fantasy and mashed it into the new Square Enix. Helmed by Nomura. What's interesting is that this game obviously had a bigger budget and a higher priority than even Final Fantasy 16, which when you compare them side by side and the personnel who were involved in making them, it's quite obvious that 7 Remake has it all, while 16 is definitely a step down in terms of budget, and it's the B team. So 7 Remake has taken over from the actual franchise itself. Pretty interesting. Personally, there were some interesting parts that were mostly for me to do with the original game. I liked the combat. And I like the idea of what they're going for, because you have so many people like me that have that nostalgia and the love for the original game, and to use that as a story mechanic is a pretty cool idea. I don't like the person in charge of coming up with that idea and implementing it, but we'll see. Here's the chorus. This theme song, one of the only song composed by series composer Uematsu for this game. Fantasy VII Remake. Number 11. Voted by 5 people. And this one had some shockingly high pieces from, I would say, some people that haven't played a lot of the older ones. So this is where we're kind of seeing that mix again. But this has an interesting mix of old fans and new fans for this one. I may have already given it away. At number 11. Final Fantasy for fans new and old. Released in 2016. Development beginning in, wait for it, 2006, and then announced immediately after development started at the E3 2006. Originally called Versus 13, it was supposed to be a spin-off, part of the Fabula Nova Chrysalis. By the time they finally got this game out, switching directors in the middle of it, changing it from Versus 13 to Final Fantasy 15, they realized we need to fill in a lot of the gaps. So to do that, they launched it alongside a feature film starring the bald guy, the little young guy from Breaking Bad. Watching him sit on a couch on a stage talking about his role in the new Final Fantasy movie Kingsglaive was hilarious. There was an anime. If you really want to get all the story, you better play that VR fishing game. It's probably a miracle that they brought this all together. There's some great moments. It's quite messy. It was a very strange game that I cannot believe they got to work. If I constantly keep in my mind, they could have just scrapped this. What they came up with works. I had a good time exploring this game, from pushing the car in the desert to getting to your first gas station, to your first town, to your first resort, to your city. I felt the ending is where it totally fell apart and felt like, oh, this is where the other game has been tacked on. Yeah, and the combat's quite boring, but it was fun to hang out with the boys, and I thought there were some interesting story moments there. Claudio doesn't like it. Not a bad game, but feels nothing like a Final Fantasy game. Felix, combat bad for you. Had a good vibe with the boys. Me and Felix would play the game of let's close our eyes and win this battle. Technically, I guess there was only one city, but I did like the progression of it. Interesting game. But when you spend 10 years and a lot of money, you probably want it to be more than... That was an interesting experiment. I think this song really captures the heartbreak people had. Dr. Schwartzers says, what could that mean, though? The series has shifted with almost every game, so it feels like Final Fantasy is a bit confusing, to say the least. I'd say this one and say like 12 feel where they feel like they're off doing their own thing. A heartbreaking game for the people that waited 10 years for Versus 13. But definitely a solid game. Are you ready for the top 10 as ranked by us? Top 10. This next game was voted by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. Some people ranked it incredibly high. Some people ranked it incredibly low. I bet you know what I'm talking about. What can I do for you? Final Fantasy X-2. Following up the wild success of Final Fantasy X with something completely different. A battle system was wildly different with very complex mechanics layered like the clothing you would change into. The combat system laid the groundwork for the much more polished battle system of 13. It's a story that's a mix of extreme Saturday morning cartoon camp and extreme melodrama. To me, this story felt like that game where you write something down on a piece of paper, you pass it to the next person, they'd write something down on a piece of paper with lines of dialogue following each other and points of the story seemingly made up on the fly. When I think of this game, I think of being on that ship, brother coming over and yelling something ridiculous, then the characters doing a dance and having a concert, and then trying to shoehorn in some drama from what happened at the end of Final Fantasy X. This would be the equivalent if Half-Life 2 Part 3, instead of resolving the cliffhanger, made it into a Dance Dance Revolution game. I hated this game because I played it immediately after my first time of playing Final Fantasy X. And the battle system I can appreciate for being a good idea, but God, did I hate the story. This was when Square had joined up with Enix. They had the failure of the Spirits Within movie, and a lot of people accused this game of being a pretty blatant cash grab. And it feels like they went with their most recent hit, Final Fantasy X, threw some stuff together with reused assets, a thrown together story, and came up with this. Okay, this has been on the screen for quite a long time. All right, let's go. Number 9 in our top 17. This one was voted on by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people for 73 points. Just to give you some reference, Final Fantasy X-2 got 62 points. Final Fantasy 15 got 58 points. 7 Remake got 53 points. Final Fantasy V got 49 points. And so on and so forth, with the last game getting only 26 points. Okay, I'm really trying not to read ahead and accidentally read the wrong title at this point. All right, number 9. Number 9. This one had 3 top rankings and 3 more sort of middle of the road rankings, which gave it a pretty nice spot. Are you ready? Another sequel, another -2. Final Fantasy 13-2, released after the very controversial Final Fantasy 13. Final Fantasy 13's too narrow. 13-2 gives you open areas. No towns? Here's a bunch of towns. Here's a bunch of NPCs. Here's a bunch of side quests. We're also going to double down on the crazy story and introduce time travel, fates, emotions. We're going to have a villain that looks like a Sephiroth fanfic wet dream come to life. The budget felt a little tighter in spots. You only had 2 main characters and you collected a bunch of different monsters to level up and fight alongside you. I felt like this was this game, I wanted more 13 and I wanted a bit more personality, and it gave it to me. And I actually did enjoy playing this one the second time. The music was great. I thought it had a nice ending. I enjoyed the new villains, the new characters. I liked how emotive Sarah was. I was really not ready to go back to, because she seemed like kind of a nothing character in 13. I thought she was a pretty nice one. Sarah was very likable. And speaking as a guy, she was so hot. I loved her. I love that outfit she wore. All the different outfits. Yeah, it was. As soon as I fired up 13.2, I was thinking, oh my god, look at the font is crazy and all the bars and stuff. But it was, they tried to give people what they wanted out of 13 while still continuing down that path. It must be tough to sort of change midstream, but it's a very interesting game, but you have to be into pretty crazy storylines. Although there are some personal moments that I quite liked. At number 8, voted by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people with 81 points. This one is 8 points higher than Final Fantasy 13-2. This had 2 really high rankings, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 sort of total pretty high rankings, and a couple more middle of the pack ones that gave it a pretty strong presence. Some surprising people voted on this one. Final Fantasy IV. Released in North America as Final Fantasy II. The first one on the Super Nintendo, jumping from the NES to the SNES, raising the bar of storytelling. It was a wonderful tale of right and wrong, internally and with your place in the world. You start off in the game doing a mission that your own character realizes, am I doing the right thing? And then battling with yourself. You actually encounter a battle with yourself. And the only way to progress in that battle is to technically lose in a way. It's a heck of a game. I was pretty surprised. There were some late submissions that came in that bumped this one up quite a lot higher, where Lightning Returns was a lot higher before. The battle with Cecil and himself, I loved. The game gives you a super powered ability, this sort of dark power that's so powerful compared to every other attack and everything else is doing, and you end up having to transition to a new character that doesn't have that anymore. It's a really cool way of telling the story using actual game mechanics. A fantastic game. I played this in a very cold car in Canada, driving my girlfriend to a gig where she taught people to paint at a bar, and I played this on my Android phone on an emulator for like 3-4 hours, and my girlfriend comes out, she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you had to wait. Why didn't you go somewhere else?" I go, "No, I was having a lot of fun." Except I got to the point where I was quick saving, and I got to the battle with yourself, and I couldn't progress, and I had to start all over again. Which means I haven't beat this game. Oh, watch out. Okay. Next up, baby cakes. Number 7. Votes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 people voted for this one. Nobody gave it a top ranking, but it has a whole lot of bronze medals. So it won a lot of people over in that sense, and some lower rankings. And that's this list is not just ranking, say, the best one, but it's kind of ranking what games reached the most people and had the most positive effect. Make sure this song's cranked up. R.I.P. earphones. Final Fantasy VIII. How do you follow up the most popular release in your franchise, Final Fantasy VII? One of the most popular games on the console. When I played this game, the first quarter of it, I was already re-ranking in my head. I need to seriously consider, is this better than a lot of the other Final Fantasies I've played? The first quarter of it, I loved the combat. I liked the draw system. I liked the characters. I loved the look of it. I loved the soundtrack, exploring the world. All that whole vibe of Final Fantasy was there. Then the story gets crazy and lost me. Final Fantasy VII story gets crazy too, but it pulls you along the whole way. And this one I felt like made 2 huge jumps that some people loved and other people did not. That's why, for me, I had it 7th on my list, I believe. And other people had it real high up. I ranked it down with Cephalon. Felix ranked it very high. Claudio, Solis, Chris. Oh, no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Where did I have this ranked? I had this ranked quite high. Up with me and Lachlan had it pretty high. Rudy, Cephalon, Prince, we all had it pretty high. Leonard did not have it. You say you ranked it 3rd? I don't know about that. Anyways, there's a very interesting part in this game where the dancers for Queen... hang on a second. Up next. So that was Final Fantasy VIII in 7th place. In 6th place, and perhaps tied with the last one. It was super close. And with a potential Leonard voting error because he gave me his first list all crazy. We have this game with 92 points. Voted very highly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. Voted it pretty highly, and 3 more voted it sort of middle and lower. Final Fantasy XII. A more mature, grounded Final Fantasy, a real world with real politics. I enjoyed exploring this world the most, a lot more than actually playing it. I think Chris said it best when he said this is the one world you could actually suspend your disbelief that it could actually exist. It did feel real. I mean, the marketplaces, the deserts, the way people live, the cities. I really felt immersed, even playing this game whenever they put out the remaster, say 2017, 2018. It has some interesting things where they did force Van into the game to give the audience somebody to hang out with. That's why he's generally sitting off to the side of all the situations, asking dumb questions. I think they should have had the balls to go with Baltier or even Pinelo, that maybe they didn't want to have this girl as the main character. It had an interesting palette. All the cutscenes reminded me of the early Star Wars movies too. They were so kind of like lush, and you could just see the money everywhere. It was like those times in histories when the empires have grown so large and there's so much money everywhere. It was a very sandy, sort of washed out palette. Set in the world of Ivalice, with a vagrant story and Final Fantasy Tactics. It's a pretty good looking game. It was another one where they decided, let's totally change up the combat system. Let's take some risks here. Once you get to that point where you can actually leave the combat system, go have some lunch, and you come back and you've leveled up, it is pretty interesting. I think as a whole, the game is incredibly cohesive and still gives you a lot of choice in terms of being an RPG, and still gives you a large, grand story. It just told it in a different way. I think it felt like, let's maybe make this for people that came in with 10 and had kind of grown up. Like if you think of Final Fantasy IX being the one where it was, okay, our fans have grown up from playing the older ones and are nostalgic. And that's, to me, that feels like that. This is like 4 or 5 years after, people are a little older. Apparently the latter half got rewritten quite a bit once the director changed. Very interesting. You think 12 suffered from the same thing as 6 to a lesser degree? Where it didn't know who should be the protagonist. I think the soundtrack worked really well. It had to be way different. It was a fun game. Yeah, and it had the residue of Final Fantasy XI. All right, let's go to our top 5 Final Fantasy single-player games ranked by you. This one had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 votes. 7 votes. 7 votes. 7 votes. I'd say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'd say all of these votes are very, very high. This game got probably the most, so far it's got the most high-ranking votes. This one basically got its spot on silver medals. So here we go. Number 5 in our top 5 of our top 17. Sakaguchi created Final Fantasy and directed 1 through 5, with Kitase taking over as director for 6, 7, and 8. 7 and 8 were so bombastically gigantic, they brought in an entirely new audience, new consoles, new ways of playing RPGs. But what about the old fans? What about Sakaguchi? Well, 9 was for them. For Sakaguchi, his favorite. Big-headed, good-spirited characters went on a fun adventure with a little kid princess, a rogue with an animal's tail, a Buzz Lightyear knight, a cute blue mage who was also going through an existential crisis. It was a beautiful tribute, a revisiting and a farewell to the first era of Final Fantasy. I played Final Fantasy IX on my Vita. I had so much fun playing it on my Vita, I sold my PS4 and didn't buy another one until Crazy Cause, my boss, asked me to review another PS4 game. I totally disappeared into this world. I just loved the adventure. I like the theming of them being the people that put on, they roam from town to town and they put on plays, because it felt like I was in a play, and it felt like it just felt like it embraced that. I loved when I asked I was talking to 2 guards at the beginning of a town, and one of them was giving me the whole layout of the place, like guards usually do, NPCs usually do. in these games. And after he tells me everything about the town, the other guard looks at him and says, "Are you a guard or a tour guide?" Jeez. The first 3 quarters do have great pacing. I actually haven't beaten this game, but I got to the point where I realized, okay, I'm going to have to... I get where this is going, and I don't really care. But I loved so much of it. Final Fantasy IX. Top 4! At number 4... voted by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people, giving it 117 votes over Final Fantasy IX's. How many votes did it have? It had 108. So it actually, yeah, it has a healthy enough lead. There's no controversy here at all. Want to know what it is? Final Fantasy 13. Very divisive. Very much a product of our channel ranking this for it to get this high. I bought this game for about $5, and I started playing it after not playing video games for a while, and definitely not playing Final Fantasies for a while. And I liked the combat system and the boss battles, and then I kind of put it away. I brought it out again and started playing it, started talking to the audience more, even just with uploads, and ended up streaming the game. And it was my first game streaming, and I was so excited waking up every day and playing this with a big chat full of people. Luigi. I don't know if anybody here was back there on that first game. Maybe Claudio? Maybe? Anyways, there's no prelude to open this up. No NPCs. No towns. But still one of the best looking video games ever, with a unique take on real-time strategic RPG combat that takes 11 chapters to fully unlock that combat in a 13-chapter game. Another mix of universe-bending melodrama with intimate personal moments. I love this game, and I hate parts of this game. It was a game that changed my life and got me to play video games in front of a camera for the last few years, for better or worse, but it did introduce me to all of you lovely people. Chris mentioned it well in his notes to me that most Final Fantasy games were not that open. They were not that non-linear, but there was definitely more of an illusion. This did away with all of that illusion, and it was just a constant straight down the corridor with gorgeous backgrounds that really felt like they were just green screened in, and it never felt like you were really interacting with. But the combat and the personal moments and the epicness of it and the overall journey, I still really like this game, and I had a great time with it. And this is definitely, I mean, there are not many lists you're going to see of people ranking Final Fantasy that this is going to be that high. This is definitely a product of our crowd. Top 3. But first, here are some Chocobo themes. And we're actually going to look at what the top selling Final Fantasy games are. So, ranked by sales, the top one is Final Fantasy VII with 16 million sales, Final Fantasy XIV with 10.9 million sales, Final Fantasy VI with 10 million sales, Final Fantasy X with 9.75 million sales, and Final Fantasy VIII with 9.65 million sales. So, by the money, go 7, 14, 6, 10, and 8. Are we ready for the top 3? The God tier? Or is it even higher than a God tier? And what's higher than a God? Friends. Friends can defeat gods. All right, thank you for the Chocobo music. At number 3, with 3 pretty high votes, 4 pretty high votes, a lot of high votes. A lot of votes, but a few that ranked it a little lower. than the rest, obviously. Ranked only 1 point behind number 2. Only 1 point ranked behind number 2. What is it you say? Final Fantasy VII. The best-selling Final Fantasy. I remember standing in front of televisions at the mall, at the Sony store, watching this demo over and over again, watching the commercials. More people knew about this game than any Final Fantasy before it, and maybe any other Final Fantasy after it. The game was mind-blowing. It used cinema-quality computer-generated effects. It combined them with polygons, beautifully hand-drawn, pre-rendered backgrounds. I love the technology of this game on the PS1. I loved replaying this game. It still works for me. I love the overall vibe. For me, I put this one top. At the time it was, compared to the other computer-generated graphics of 1996, 1997. While I think some other Final Fantasies are maybe better made and are a better overall experience from start to finish, I personally love this one. I love the atmosphere, the music. Combat I don't think is as good as, say, Final Fantasy X. Less strategic. But if I could only play one of them, it would be this one. No, yeah, you're totally right about Toy Story. It definitely cost them a lot of money to make the visuals. This got 2 first place votes. It got a second place vote, 2/3, a 4th, a 6th, and an 8th. Final Fantasy VII. I love it. In second place, with three first place votes, a second place vote, a third place vote, a fourth place, a fifth place, a seventh place, and a 11th place vote from somebody who's really played a lot of these games. This is number 2. Final Fantasy VI, which means you're a winner. You're a winner. We'll get back and we'll talk about Final Fantasy VI, but I do want to hear this one just to announce the winner of this, ranked by us, is Final Fantasy X. Okay, we'll get back to that. So, Final Fantasy VI. I made a video discussing the first 5 minutes of this game and how impactful they are, how cinematic this game is, how it really felt. You got to imagine when this game came out on the Super Nintendo, and your game choices were what was on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. This started to really pave the way for cinematic storytelling in a grand kind of mainstream scale. Huge cast of characters, your choice of who to play as, a lot of choices, so many interesting places to visit. It really maxed out everything they could do for two-dimensional pixel art retro Final Fantasy. There was a suicide scene in it. I would say that some of the love stuff felt a little bit forced, but they never really hit you over the head with it. So it kind of felt like it was just there. But the opening is pretty incredible. A huge twist halfway through where the villain wins. And you have to... The whole world changes with that. I think that really shocked people. You thought, well, the villain never wins, will they? And they do. And then you have to pick up the pieces in the second half of the game and get the band back together. It's a hell of an adventure with a lot of memorable characters, memorable places, incredible music, fun combat, lots of things to discover. It's a hell of a game. It's the only Final Fantasy without a main character, though I always thought Celeste was. Not Celeste, sorry, Terra. This is Terra's. All right, let's go on to Final Fantasy X. At number one. This got 1, 2, 3, 4 first place votes. 1, 2 second place votes. A third place. A fourth place. It got a 7th place and a 10th place vote as well. But it smashed everybody. While Final Fantasy 6 and 7 were battling with 129 points and 128 points, Final Fantasy X smacks them aside with almost 20 points more than Final Fantasy 6 and 20 points more than Final Fantasy 7. This game is in that sweet spot where both of our generations, if you want to say that I'm a generation and say people that grew up with like PS2 and PS3 are a different generation, almost everybody's played this one. And I would say that even though I personally like Final Fantasy VII more, Final Fantasy X, I'll say, is a better game and is the best Final Fantasy from top to bottom. And it rewards multiple playthroughs. As soon as I finished it, I thought, I want to go back and play this now that I know what's going to happen and see it through Auron's eyes. The first time you're Tidus, discovering everything for the first time, and there's so many memorable moments, memorable places. It really feels like you're going on a journey with these characters. You get items by people handing them to you. There's such an arc for Yuna, for Tidus, for Auron, for even Waka and the Pale Girl and Riku. And actually getting to choose how you level them up is a huge thing. It really felt like an RPG in that sense. The battle system, I think, is, for the turn-based ones, by far my favorite. I know that active time battle was introduced in Final Fantasy IV and was what separated Final Fantasy from other JRPGs. But there were so many times where I agonized over a turn in Final Fantasy X. Seeing that turn order above and going, if I use an item, I can do another attack. If I do this, I can do this. I should be able to take out that person first. So much strategy. Swapping in your whole team, so you're using the whole team. Different kinds of weapons. Different magic. It's a hell of a game. I definitely, yeah, exactly. Like Sixth Sense or Donnie Dark, you want to go through with that new insight. Final Fantasy X. And definitely has more great songs than 7. I love a lot of the songs in 7, but I would say that, Besaid Island, Wandering Through the Flame, this one, Silence Before the Storm. I think this was also when they started bringing in other composers as well. But Uematsu was showing that he was still the king, even if you brought in other people to add a different flavor. Final Fantasy X is our top. So, at the bottom, Final Fantasy II. Number 16, Final Fantasy I. Number 15, Final Fantasy III. Number 14, Lightning Returns. Number 13, Final Fantasy V. Number 12, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1. Number 11, Final Fantasy 15. Number 10, Final Fantasy X-2. Shockingly high, I think. At number 9, Final Fantasy 13-2. The only one Serini voted on, by the way. Number 8, Final Fantasy 4, a classic, rises high. I'm pretty impressed 4 got that high. Number 7, Final Fantasy 8. At number 6, Final Fantasy 12. I wonder if the remaster helped with that one. Number 5, Final Fantasy 9. A beautiful love letter. I'm glad that one got a high ranking. Number 4, Final Fantasy 13, because this is the 90s Kid channel. And Prince is here. Number 3, Final Fantasy 7. I love you. Number 2, Final Fantasy 6. The old people get their votes in. Back in their day, Final Fantasy 6 was the best Final Fantasy. And right in the middle of Final Fantasy 10, number 1. If you're watching the video version of this, the video will end now. Thank you for watching. If you're on the stream, it'll continue on and we can BS about Final Fantasy. Bye!